Hi, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Conservation Scientist Seminar Series. I'm really excited about this week, and we're going to do things a little bit differently than we normally do. So we'll still have a Q&A at the end, but if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, save them till the end. But we are going to do things a little differently. With Caitlin here, we're going to try and take a more interactive approach and do a few practice sessions throughout. And hopefully everyone can get a little practice telling their own science story. So feel free through those sessions, you can either drop some of your material in the chat, or I'd encourage anyone to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and participate out loud. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Caitlin Looby. Caitlin's a science writer, editor, and educator. She's written for radio, university media, and local, international, and online news. She also wrote an op-ed on climate change and cloud forests for the New York Times, as well as feature articles for outdoor magazines, among others. She's also a freelance editor where she's edited books, dissertations, poetry collections, and even restaurant menus. Here at the U, she teaches a SciComm class and workshops, which, side note, I highly recommend anyone looking to kind of build their SciComm skills to take that course. It's really helped me quite a bit. Caitlin's trained as a scientist who spent 12 years hiking up mountains in the tropics to study microbes, soil, and climate change. She holds a bachelor's degree in molecular biology from the University of Connecticut, a master's degree in biotechnology from Kean University, and a doctorate degree in biology from the University of California, Irvine. And one fun fact that I can sympathize with, she's lived in every time zone in the continental US. So with that, Caitlin, feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Jack. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to my talk today. As Jack mentioned, I have a lot of different expertise. Right now at the University of Minnesota, I'm a SciComm training development coordinator. And I also am a freelance writer and editor. And kind of as somebody who's coming into this as a former scientist, I understand what it's like to be on both sides of science communication. So the scientist side and also the journalism side. And so I also understand what it's like to start shifting your brain and the language that you use in order to talk to others about science. So I'm excited to give you a little bit of my knowledge and expertise today on this topic. So today we're going to kind of like cover the basics. So we're going to talk about avoiding jargon, getting to know your audience, finding common ground with that audience, and also learning a little bit more about how to tell a story. And like Jack mentioned, I'm hoping to make this a little bit different and make it slightly interactive, not too much, but just enough to kind of let you start thinking and developing some of your science communication skills. Because I know it can be really hard to listen to a talk like this, and then you're trying to revisit your notes later on and trying to remember what we talked about. So I'm going to help lead you through this process a little bit step by step to help give you a toolkit that you can kind of start you on your SciComm journey. So first, what is science communication? Science communication is the practice of distilling technical information about science-related topics into easy to understand messages and stories. And there's lots of different domains of science communication. And I think it's really important to talk about for multiple reasons. So first, there's lots of conversations going on about whether or not scientists should be advocates, whether or not science writers or science journalists should be advocates, and in what domains it's actually okay to give your opinion. And also, if you're interested in science communication, it's good to realize what part of science communication that you think maybe you would be best suited for. So first, there's science communication. So these are scientists like yourselves who talk publicly about your own work or your field. And then there's science writers, so science journalists who report on other people's work. And very much so, they're using kind of journalistic properties where they're not giving their opinions, not giving biases, depending on the outlet, of course, but most of the time not. And then there's also science advocacy, and these are experts who engage with lawmakers and advocate for evidence-based policy. Now, before I go into some more of the details about science communication, I want to let you all know that science communication is very much going through a rebranding moment right now, and a very much needed rebrand. So when you start to think about science communication, I actually want you to think about inclusive science communication. Now, I can give you an entire workshop on inclusive science communication, and that's something that the Science Communication Lab does and offers. And people have dedicated their entire careers to it. But when you listen to this talk, I want you to start thinking about ways that you can engage with a wider range of people and incorporate different voices and expertise into your science and your science communication. Now, I have this quote up here from Dr. Sunshine Menendez, and she's kind of like one of the founders of inclusive science communication. And I highly suggest that you all check her out because her work is absolutely amazing. And one quote that she has is, "The most important thing that scientists need to be thinking about right now is focusing on how to engage in conversations with a much wider range of people and respond in ways that may change the scientist's research program, their research methods, the ways they think about sharing their research findings." Now, I know this statement may be a little bit scary because it's a very big undertaking, but it's a really important undertaking as well. So when you're going into science communication and kind of like thinking about your own science, find ways that can help you be more inclusive through changing your research programs, your research methods possibly, and the ways that you start thinking about your research findings and who they're meant for. Now, before I go and start talking about jargon or giving any sort of information about that, I want you all to take about 5 minutes and I want you just to free write what you do, so what your research is. And I want you to not think, just write and say whatever you usually say, use jargon if you want. This is not a shaming activity. And in fact, I'm not even gonna ask you to share this part, but just write down like your usual elevator pitch about what you do with science and try and do it in about 50 words or less. And then we're going to continue throughout the rest of the seminar to work and refine this. So I'll give you about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on. Okay, I'll give about 1 more minute and just wrap up, write down whatever you can. Okay, so just wrap up whatever you're writing and then leave it be for a minute. We'll come back and touch it in a few minutes. So the first thing that I want to talk about are the different levels of jargon. And you may just think there's one level of jargon, you know, those really hard to understand words that kind of not a lot of people understand. But there's actually 4 different levels of jargon that I want you to be aware of. And some of them may actually surprise you. So the first one, level 1, the obvious jargon. So these are challenging words for the average person. And I have climate change example words throughout this slide. So physiology, chlorofluorocarbons, deforestation. Next, there's contextual jargon. So words or phrases that are particular to your field, but may mean something completely different to somebody else in another field or somebody with other expertise. So words like this are adaptation, uncertainty, positive feedback, gradient, elevation, and neutral. Next, there's compound words. So words like at scale or multi-scale. And these are words that you really want to kind of avoid, because if you close your eyes and say these words, nothing visual really comes to mind. So really it's a missed opportunity to kind of have a visual moment with your audience. And then finally, the last and hardest for people to identify are administrator words or phrases, which I like to call academic filler. So words like and phrases like this include as a result of, the consequences of, predicted to, due to, or knowledge gaps. These are words that you really want to start to eliminate, because they're words that if you're talking to one of your friends or family members, you're probably not going to use them in a conversation. So when you're doing science communication, you want to avoid them as well, because this is going to help make your tone and what you're saying a lot more conversational and a lot more relatable. And a lot of these words and phrases are just empty phrases as well. They don't really mean a whole lot. And it's another opportunity where you can try and say something that's much more visual. So to provide some examples of this, I want to show some postcards from AGU. This is a really great site. I highly suggest that you all check this out. But they just did a bunch of postcards kind of showing that words that mean something completely different to the average person than they do to scientists. So the word like driver, most people don't think of that like an influential factor. They think of somebody driving a car. And then there's positive feedback. Most people are not thinking about how to amplify a loop or a vicious cycle. And then finally, there's modeling. So most people, when they hear modeling, they're not thinking of computer simulations. Next, I want to talk a little bit about getting to the point. So as scientists, we are trained that we need to front load with a lot of background information. So whenever we go to write our manuscripts or a grant or a fellowship, we include all this background information up front and supporting details, because we're trained that we need to convince the reader or the audience that we're an expert before we ever go to actually say anything. So leading with a bunch of background, supporting details, and then finally getting to the main point, which are the results or conclusion. But when you're doing science communication, you need to flip this around. You need to lead with the conclusion and why this is important. And then you can add some supporting details at the end. But you want to remember too, when you're doing science communication, they are not, the people that you're talking to, they're not your colleagues, they're not your advisors, they're not your committee members. They don't need to listen to everything that you're going to say. They can walk away at any time, or they can stop reading at any time. So you need to make sure you get to the point right away. Okay, the second round of practice. I want you all to go through what you wrote, and I want you to highlight or circle any of the jargon. And that includes the 4 different levels. So there's those really challenging words, the compound words, contextual jargon, and also that academic filler. And I'll give you about 3 minutes. And I would love it if anybody would want to unmute and call themselves out for having some jargon, or feel free to drop in some of your jargon words into the chat as well. Nice. Thanks for these. Yeah, functional role is definitely a good one. Thanks also for sharing your pitches. Assess fish populations. That's also a great one because there's so many other opportunities to give more discrete words about like what you're doing when you assess something. Are you counting? Are you looking at behavior? And then also species interactions. That's great as well. Evidence-based. Perfect. These are really great. Thanks so much for sharing. I'll give it about a minute. So feel free to keep dropping them in the chat. Oh yeah, these are all good. Stakeholders, yes. Landscape scale, aquatic invasive species, rebuilding populations. Even sometimes the word populations won't make sense depending on the audience that you're talking with. Qualitative differences, that's also a great one. Competition dynamics. Okay, well, I'm going to move on. Feel free to keep on dropping your jargon in the chat. Thanks so much for everybody who called themselves out. I really appreciate that. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about getting to know your audience. It's really important that you don't just talk at your audience and don't just tell, you need to show them about what you're talking about. And one way to do this is really by hooking them. So leading with a character, leading with a visual example, leading with something that's going to really get them excited and especially tap into their sense of wonder. Because so many people are interested in science because of that idea of wonder and discovery. Science is a really creative process where you're basically creating new knowledge from nothing. You really want to tap into that idea because not a lot of people really understand what the scientific process is like and really how creative it can be. You also want to make sure that you're being respectful, inclusive, and authentic. And part of being authentic about science is really just showing people that it can be a complete pain in the butt to do. Doing field work is not easy. Doing lab work is not easy. It can be really tedious. So really letting people into that whole process is a great thing to do, especially when you're trying to connect with your audience. And then you also want to make sure that you customize. So figure out what your audience cares about, choose your main takeaway, and then find a clear, concise map to get there. And I just want to leave some examples about different types of science media and even how these different media kind of go after different audiences. So first we have the types of media that lean more towards an academic audience. So that would be places like Nature, Science, Scientific American. Most people walking around on the street have no idea what these places are, and they tend to use a little bit more jargon, and they can go there a little bit more with some of the scientific information that they include. Then there's that science primed audience. So like National Geographic, Popular Science, Discover Magazine. These are people that already probably have an interest in science, and you can kind of tap into that sense of wonder though a little bit more because that's probably more leaning towards like a high school educated audience. And then finally, there's local audiences. So this would be places like the Star Tribune, who does a lot of great science and climate change reporting. And then also the Twin Cities Pioneer Press. And it's really important that if you're ever interacting with more local audiences, and this is really important with your outreach too, that you need to have some sort of local tie to your research, like really connect with what is going on within the community and within the area that you live. So next, once you figure out who your audience is, it's important to find common ground. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about ways to do this just when it comes to everyday science communication. So one way to find common ground is to kind of tap into that cultural element. So are there any cultural references that relate to your work? Then there's also personal. Why do you study this system or this research question? These are really important things to include because it's so important these days to kind of get that human interest element into science and science communication. And one way by doing that is really just giving personal anecdotes that you can share. Then there's also breaking news. So how does your work connect with what is going on in your community or society? Why is it timely? There's also that local heartbeat element. So what is the issue that matters most to the person that you're talking to? And then finally, there's misconceptions. So what's one thing about your research topic that most people get wrong? That's a really good way to connect and kind of have a teaching moment with your science communication. Now, I also wanted to include a little bit about finding common ground when perhaps you're in a little bit of an adversarial conversation, because we know so much now that science has gotten to be a little bit political. So I wanted to just drop some tools about maybe how to handle those conversations. So one thing you can do is use the word and instead of but. Because a lot of times if you're having a conversation and you use the word but, that immediately sends a message to the other person that you're telling them that they're wrong or that they don't understand. And it's much better off to keep the conversation going if you can use a word like and, because then that other person won't get so defensive. And you can also use common ground to pivot. So one thing you can say is, I really understand where you're coming from. I also talk about some sort of common ground that you have, and let me tell you about how I think about this. And that's another great example about how you can use and instead of but, and it doesn't stop the conversation. It keeps it moving and it keeps everybody kind of on the same page. And then some other examples that you can use are, let me tell you what I've been seeing, or what we see as an even bigger issue is. So practice round 3. Now I want you to write down one example of how you can find common ground and give your research context. And I have some of the examples up here. So again, there are cultural references, personal, breaking news, local heartbeat, misconceptions, or perhaps something else that I haven't thought of, which I would love to hear as well. So I'll give you about 3 minutes. And as you think of them, if you can drop them in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute as well, I'd love to hear about ways that you think you can find common ground with your research. That's great about the point about national parks. Yeah, and if your research includes any sort of field work, really try and see if that person has been there, if they know anything about it. And that's a really great way to get some some visual language into your science communication. Yes, and Jack, yeah, you have a great way of connecting your research about wolves and fairy tales. I love how you do that. I'll give about 1 more minute if anybody wants to share. That's another great example. That's, kind of it's kind of a mix of like personal local heartbeat, because so many people in Minnesota, they care about their waterways. They do a lot of recreational activities. So that's a great way to tap into personal local heartbeat, even cultural references. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in kind of starting at least getting you to think about ways that you can connect your research with different different ways to find common ground. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about that storytelling element. So I really love this quote here from Liz Neely. She's the former executive director of the Story Collider. And one thing that she said was, stories are a mechanism that human beings evolved to help us package information about who we are, how we survive, what we care about, and then spread those ideas through space and time. Now, humans have had their histories, hold their histories through storytelling, and they've been doing that forever. And so science communication and storytelling, it's not reinventing the wheel by any means. It's just really getting people on board with something that's already human nature. And it's very much already hardwired in our brains and how they work. So this schematic here from AGU Sharing Science talks about different ways that our brains connect with each other when we're hearing a story. So the first one is kind of that idea of neural coupling. So that's kind of like if anybody's ever telling you a story and it makes you think of some other story or something that you've been through, that's that process of neural coupling. So a part of the brain will activate and kind of help you relate to each other. Brains will also mirror each other. So there will be the same parts of the brain will light up and kind of replicate each other when they're hearing a story, also helping people to relate to each other. Then there's also a release of dopamine, which influences your mood and feelings of reward and motivation. And then finally, there's different changes and activity that happen in your cortex. So other parts of the brain are activated that kind of allow us to process information and understand language. So these are different ways that storytelling really helps our brains connect with each other. And there's actually physiological changes that are going on that help people connect. And also, it's really important just to tell stories, even when it comes to our science manuscripts and grants. There's so many studies out there in a variety of different fields, like the ones I included up here, that show that if you tell a science story, you're going to be cited more often. So even if you're not interested in doing anything in science communication, it's really important as a scientist too, to be thinking about how you can incorporate storytelling into what you're doing every day. It's also important that you don't data dump on people. So you want to replace facts with storytelling. So this is one news article that I like that was published on GRIST in 2020. And it was based on a study that was published that showed that sharing personal stories about how the climate crisis was changing people's lives was much more effective at getting people to care. So they did two different experiments in tandem. One, they had people listen to a short radio clip from Richard Mode, who is a 66-year-old band from North Carolina. And in a really heartfelt tone, Mode was talking about how hunting and fishing, which he had been doing it for decades, how it was really changing. And he talked about how he saw climate changing firsthand when he was outdoors, as ducks were migrating later in the year and trout were disappearing from their old haunts. And he gave this really heartfelt quote that said, "Trout require cold, clear, clean water. Places that I've trout fished in the past that used to hold lots of fish are warming, and the fish just aren't there like they used to be. It makes me very, very sad." Now, after listening to this segment, the study participants, who a lot of which identified as conservative or moderate, they reported a greater concern about climate change and that it was actually being caused by humans. And then they did a second part of this experiment where they were able to attribute kind of their changing minds to the fact that they really felt his sense of loss. And that was something that they really related to and something that they really empathized with. Now, when it comes to telling a story, you may have to think back to your very first days in kindergarten or elementary school, when you kind of learned about the basics of what a story is. And you really want to think about that in terms of your science communication. Just really get down to the basic details of what a story is. Now, every story contains a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you want to reflect that in your science communication. So in the beginning, that's when you want to introduce a character. And a character can be many different things. It could be a human, it can be a fish, animal, or plant that you study. It can even be an ecosystem. It can kind of be anything that you want, but you want to make sure that you tell your story in relation to this character and how the character is changing over time. So you have the beginning, which is kind of like your once upon a time moment. You're explaining the scene and the setting and getting people to really identify and care about that character. Then as you go up to your middle, there's kind of that rising action. And then you get to the middle where that's kind of the climax or the aha moment. Then there's falling action, and then you have the end, which is your resolution. So describing how that character is different at the end than they were at the beginning. And it's really important to remember too, that when you're telling a story, you have to not only focus on the characters, but you have to focus on the conflict. And there is conflict in every single aspect of life. And there is definitely conflict in your science too. That's why we ask questions. And these conflicts can be really small, like, why is this certain experiment not working in the lab? Or an even bigger conflict like climate change. You really want to think about that and center your stories around that conflict. And you really want to make sure too that you find your narrative arc within your story and find ways to relate your science to these different narrative arcs that we all know and love. So first, there's the quest or journey. So examples of this would be like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. A story like that could, when it relates to science, could be a story about field work, could be a story about the process of discovery. And then we have a rite of passage story. So an example of this would be something like Good Will Hunting, Harry Potter. And this could be, when it comes to science, the story behind a scientist or the history of how a field came into its own. Next, we have a love story. So Romeo and Juliet, Titanic, I'm sure we all know a ton of love stories we can relate to. So this can be how you fell in love or became inspired by science. Next, we have A Stranger Comes to Town and Nothing Is Ever the Same Again. This could be a movie like the one that I thought of was A Simple Favor. And a story like this, as it relates to science, could be invasive species or COVID, or even ocean acidification. And these discoveries or strangers that come to town could be good or they could be bad. So an example of bad ones would obviously be COVID, ocean acidification, invasive species, but good ones, the discovery of sanitation. That's a great example of a stranger coming to town and everything has changed. And then finally, there's mystery. So an example of this would be Knives Out, Girl on the Train. And these are great ways to kind of lead with a question. So why do people lose their taste with COVID? Why are coral reefs bleaching? It's going to be really helpful when you start to do science communication and talk about your science, if you can kind of figure out ways how they can relate to these narrative arcs. It's also important too that you don't just talk about a topic, which is usually people's inclination. So instead of talking about a topic, you want to turn that into a story. So an example I have here, so give the movie version or even the trailer, not the book version. Not everyone needs to know all those same level of details in order to learn, understand, or appreciate something. And you can start by thinking about how science can support your story, not the other way around. And stop saying words like data and results. Instead, start focusing on learning, discovery, wondering. Even just changing the words that you use can really help increase the relatability of what you're saying and help drive that story forward. Make sure to introduce the character and the conflict and be really specific about what those are. And again, focus on the beginning, middle, and end. And then after that, you just want to build in the parts where the science comes in. I'm going to give some examples of this in some work that I've written recently. Now, you may not all be going on to doing science writing, which is totally fine, but this is just to help give you examples about how you want to have your story first, introduce your characters, and then just build in the science around that. So an example I have here is a story I wrote for Manga Bay, where I wrote, drifting down the Dubo River through Sapo National Park in Liberia, Shadrach Carulane, a project manager for FFI, takes a sample of fresh river water. It's hard to see what lies beneath the surface of that turbid, fast-moving river, but the importance of that water is clear. So here, introducing a setting, introducing a character, which can be two different things in this context. It could be Shadrach, the man that I talk about, and then comes up later on in the story. But the character can also just be freshwater ecosystems. And then finally, using lots of sensory language to get the audience hooked and excited. The next paragraph, freshwater ecosystems supply drinking water, support inland fisheries, offer flood control, and deliver nutrients to forests. Yet historically, they are understudied, underfunded, and undervalued. Scientists rely on data gathered 3 to 4 decades ago while working in a race against time to figure out what freshwater ecosystems to conserve and what wildlife to prioritize. Now here is where you introduce science. So there's a little bit of science inserted by talking about why freshwater ecosystems are so important. Then the conflict comes in, and then there's some more science. So you really want to start thinking about how you want to lead with those storytelling elements and then just insert science when and where you can. I have one more example here for a story I wrote for a local news outlet in Iowa. And the first paragraph, Jean Eels dug into the earth on her farm after the fall harvest and discovered a problem. It was 2016 and the farmer that rented her land had just left. When she pulled her spade from the ground, she noticed the soil was hard and compact with layers looking like thinly stacked dinner plates. Now here, introducing a character, describing a setting, building up some tension, and also using sensory language. And I should note too that this story was written to focus on a local outlet in Iowa, but it was really a global study. So finding a way to find a character and really get that local element and building in that visual language around that. Next, healthy soil soaks up and stores more water, helping farmers grow healthy, nutritious, and productive crops. But warming temperatures are threatening the productivity of croplands throughout the Midwest, with new data showing how drought makes corn and soybean crops much more sensitive to heat. So here, introducing the science and introducing conflict. So I want to leave you with one last quote on storytelling. This is from Mariam Zaringhalam, and she's a senior producer for the Story Collider. And I really love this quote. She says, teaching science through narrative underscores the fact that knowledge is not fixed, but rather always emerging through active questioning of the unknown. Now, for the last round of practice, I want you to take a few minutes, take one more look at what you wrote, and figure out who the main character is and what the conflict is. And again, I would love it if anybody wants to be brave and unmute themselves, or you can also drop what you figure out in the chat. Nice. I love that you identified the stranger comes to town narrative. That's a great thing to use moving forward. Your character could be lots of different things too. It could be the invasive species, the other species that the invasive species are affecting. It could even be the ecosystem too. Anybody else want to share? Yeah, and that's a great point too, especially if you're working in ecosystem ecology or some type of environmental science, which I'm sure most of you are. There could be lots of different characters. Okay, well, I'm going to move on and just leave you with a few more pieces of information, but I hope this was helpful. Even if you weren't able to think of something now, think about this the next time you go to do a conference talk or even a poster, just ways that you can bring in science communication to get people more engaged and excited about what you're doing. So I wanted just to leave you all with a few strategies to engage in inclusive science communication, things that you can do. You can include different expertise in panels and seminars, realize that Western science is not the only way, draw on Indigenous and local expertise when doing field work, find ways to bring science and art together, engage with the media and recommend they speak to BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ co-authors, as well as co-authors from the Global South if you're doing field work. Use appropriate metaphors. There's lots of problematic metaphors in science. There's also lots of problematic common names in science. Try not to use those and try and be a part of the movement to help change them. Give accessible talks, use language carefully, use alt text and caption videos, and make sure that color palettes are accessible. Now, this list, of course, is not exhaustive, but just a few ideas of things you can do. And I just wanted to share a few science communication things that I love if you're interested in any more resources or ways to learn. So I really love the Open Notebook. They kind of give the stories behind science, which is a really great way to connect science with science writers. And they also have lots of resources too for people interested in science communication and science writing. I also love the Story Collider podcast. It's kind of like The Moth. And they also tell the stories behind science, and they're really great, and they cover so many different topics and really just help humanize science. I also love the Breaking Green Ceilings podcast. AGU Sharing Science has a lot of great resources, some of which I use today. And then also signing up for databases like 500 Women Scientists. There's tons of other databases where you can sign up to talk to journalists, or conference conveners can use those to help get more diversity into their sessions. Also, just try and interact with science media. Reading up on science can really help you get good ideas about how to talk about science in a relatable way. And then I also highly suggest the Inclusive SciComm Starter Kit from the Metcalf Institute. And then if you're interested in learning more, here are some things going on with the Science Communication Lab. So we do lots of workshops, and the ones that we're going to offer in the fall, you can start looking for them in the summer. Then I also have my science communication class, Biology 5701, which is just a semester-long course. I have it very much product focused, so it's geared that for it to be useful. So you can reuse things. I want you to work on things that are going to be helpful to you, very much product focused, so you can move your CV and resume forward and work on fellowships, or even get some writing samples for you to use if you want to apply for anything that's science writing related. And I also teach how to give a 3-minute thesis talk. We also do 4-week boot camps for the CBS run graduate student newsletter, BioLine. This is a great way to get a short clip up on published on the internet. And then we also have our Science Communication Fellows program, Market Science, and we have the Science Communication Labs Writers Group, and I have some contacts for that up there. And I'm happy if you want to contact me anytime to learn about more opportunities or if you have any more questions. And I'm also happy to answer questions now. So thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Caitlin. That was really helpful. Yes, if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them directly. Or if you just have part of your story to share, drop that in the chat or unmute yourself as well. I'll give a few seconds for anyone to ask.
Yeah, so the Science Communication Fellows Program, Jack can tell you a lot about that too. He's a part of it, but it's kind of this pilot program we're doing with some people that came out of my class who were really interested and great at science communication. So they're doing lots of different things, like we're getting some podcasting off the ground. They're helping contribute to BioLine. Is there anything else you want to add, Jack? Things that you all are doing?
Yeah, so we actually just finished the podcast training part, which was really awesome. We had someone come in who helps do podcasts, I think formerly for NPR and now works for the New Yorker. And that was really cool. We got to work with a lot of the hands-on gear of working with audio, and then even going in and taking, a short clip and turning that into maybe like a 5-minute podcast, or taking an interview and going into the editing software and changing that around. So that was really cool. Learning how to conduct interviews was really useful. And then, I think we'll be helping a little bit with running the BioLine boot camps, and then market science down the road, which seems like a really cool program where we go to different local markets, or you can even set it. I think I'm going to set one up in Yellowstone and do a little like interactive booth where you can kind of teach the public about your science.
But yeah, it's a great program. There's a small stipend, which is great. And it's kind of the first time we're doing it. So we're also figuring it out as we go. And it's very much like a choose your own adventure type program.
Yeah, Todd, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, and are you ever aware of situations where this can backfire? Maybe you're applying for a job and you're supposed to write your statement of research and your statement of teaching, and you have an academic audience and they say, oh, this isn't tepid and boring enough. This is too exciting. It doesn't fit the role model.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine a scenario where that would happen, because I mean, even like we've all like read bad, boring papers. We've all been to bad seminar talks. Like you want to be that scientist that's really exciting and engaging. And even like, especially if you're applying for jobs or fellowships, there's so many different people that are reading what you're writing that you want to keep them engaged and you want them to remember you. So I think it's really important to use science communication wherever you can, especially now because there's a huge push for it. And a lot of times people are expected to be good science communicators and good teachers and all these other things. And I think it's like, no matter what you're doing, it's going to be helpful.
Nick, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation, Caitlin. I want to go back to the question about the character of the story.
Yeah.
From what I've read and definitely with interactions with the media, it seems like that character is often portrayed as a hero that's trying to overcome this conflict. But science is so much more than an individual. It's this team approach, and that's often missed from my experience. I'm wondering what advice you might have to weave that into the story, to get those other characters in the mix, but still trying to be brief and concise and engaging.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing you can do, especially when you're interacting with the media, is just bring up that, this was something I worked with as a team. Maybe they should also talk to those people and like bring up the different team elements and who was participating in what part of the study and who helped out with what, and also just do what you can to like amplify those voices, especially if they're underrepresented. And I think that, often characters are used just to kind of like anchor a study, and because, as people who are reading, they can't focus on too many names. Have you, like, if you've ever read one of those books where like there's so many different characters, you can't keep track of who's who. So it's good to always anchor the study on a character, whether or not that's the researcher who's actually doing it or the specific thing that you're studying. But I think if you want science to be represented more as a collaborative process, it's important that that can be one of your main takeaways when you're talking to a journalist, is really stressing how it was a team effort, how, you know, your study is one in like this big buildup of studies that led you to that point. Those would be great things to really highlight. I hope that answered your question.
Great. And then it looks like we have one question in the chat from Thea. Can you talk a little bit about how to avoid oversimplifying in the process of making a good narrative?
Yeah, so finding the balance of what to explain and what to leave out is one of the biggest challenges for a scientist. And I think it depends on your audience, but you want to pick out 1 to 2 main points that you want the person to walk away with and focus your story on that. Like, even when I go to teach students how to do a 3-minute thesis talk, they don't describe their entire dissertation. They describe maybe one part of it, maybe even one figure or one chapter. And it's just like a good way to give people like a snippet of what you're doing, because they don't need to know all of that information in order to get the gist of what's going on. But definitely finding that balance between what to leave in and what to leave out is a huge challenge.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind. I am curious, it's very much along the lines with what you were talking about. I always have a hard time thinking about dropping detail off when I'm doing SciComm. And it's like the hardest thing to not try to sell someone this entire package of concepts about the ecology of lakes is what I work on. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of curious on what your thoughts are on that. Do you just have to acknowledge at some point that like you will lose everyone if you try that and you just need to sell a piece of it? Or can you come up with a broader storyline that takes 20 minutes to tell? I don't know. I'm curious about your thoughts on that. I always struggle with that, and I want to give all of the information. I have such a hard time cutting it up and just offering a snippet.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I would really just focus on who your audience is. Like, if it's something dealing with like lakes, as I believe you mentioned, like, are you talking to somebody who cares just about like lakes in Minnesota? Or is this maybe like this broader global picture, and kind of like focus on one aspect of it? Like, wherever that common ground is, just talk about that. And know too that even if like you're talking to the media or reporters, it's really hard for them too to not want to put everything in. Like, we all want to explain everything, but there's not always the time and place for that. So I would really just focusing on finding that common ground, and then just focusing on that in the moment. And if the person's interested, if they want to learn more, then you can talk about other things.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then it looks like Donald has a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Mostly about differences between written and verbal communication, which is a great question.
Yeah, I think a lot of this goes along with like either having conversations or giving presentations as well. Like, if you're talking to a non-academic audience, just get to the point right away, and then you can build in those extra pieces of information. Because like I said, like if you're doing a piece of outreach and you're having a conversation with somebody, they can leave at any point in that conversation. So you want to make sure that they walk away with that main point, and not a detail that may not necessarily relate or connect to your main point. And then, so you lead with your main point, you lead with something that's exciting, like a hook, or like a visual storytelling element. And then after that, you can just kind of like give those details if they want those details, like very much so. There's even a big movement now that like, you know, an elevator pitch, like they may be out of fashion now. Like, it's pretty much, you don't want to ever be having a unidirectional conversation. You don't want to be talking at people. You want it to be a conversation where you're going back and forth. So give them the information that they're interested in.
Great. And then it doesn't look like we have anything left in the chat. Any other questions for Caitlin? Awesome. Well, thanks again, Caitlin. Oh,
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was a really, really fantastic talk. And I always love learning more about how we can improve our storytelling in science.
Thanks. Well, have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining.